How's it going, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Commander Quantified. This episode, Quantified Theory on Gaining the Advantage, and this is the first part of two. The second will probably be in the form of a podcast because these things aren't quite as quantifiable in the second half. Before we get started, like the video, subscribe to the channel, support me on Patreon if you're able. That'll keep the lights on around here and keep me going and bringing you new content. All right, with that, let's get into it. So first let's talk about some of the resources that we have available to us in Commander. The first of which is going to be cards. And cards you have in your deck, right? In your hand and in an accessible zone. So specifically, these are the resources you have available to you. So in the deck, you have 100 cards. You have a finite amount of those. In fact, there is a strategy called mill, which basically if you have no more cards in your deck, you lose the game. You have cards in your hand that are available for you to cast and turn into spells, which then can impact the game. Until such a time, they're just regarded as cards. And third, it is in an accessible zone. So let's say something like you have exiled, but you can play until the beginning of your next end step. Or if you have it in your graveyard, but your commander happens to be able to cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard once during each of your turns casts. So these are finite resources. Mana is another one of your resources. So you get your land for turn. You can ramp and increase your available mana on a given turn. Or you can kind of leverage your mana with how you use your cards, and I will get into that in a little bit. And the last resource you really have, and these are the major ones, there are others, but these are the primaries, are you start with 40 life, and you don't die until 0, so you can leverage your life total as a resource. With that in mind, I actually wanted to bring to the table some core principles specifically of finance, because if you talk about managing resources, finance is actually something that readily addresses that subject and can give us some really good insight. So I've altered the definitions of certain things a little bit, but you'll get the point here. So liquidity refers to the efficiency or ease with which, let's say, one of our different resources, cards, mana, or life, can be converted into a spell or maybe an ability. Buying power refers to the amount of cards, mana, life available for players to cast spells or activate abilities in a turn. So you can see how these principles are actually really relevant to playing Magic and resource management, which is one of the fundamental mechanics of the game. And that's why we're really looking at that here. Generating advantage is really important to being able to play an effective game. So with these principles in mind, let's move forward. So with cards, how do we gain the advantage? Well, let's see here. So we have draw, which means we can get access to more cards. Access in general, so if you aren't necessarily drawing the card into your hand, but you're drawing it into an accessible zone, like we were talking about with graveyard or an exile, you have removal that you can generate card advantage with. You have modal spells that you can generate card advantage with, and you can generate new cards via tokens, right? Or copies or anything like that. I guess those would technically still be tokens. So cards like divination are your card draw, right? You spend one card, you get two. You're also spending mana, but we'll get to that in a minute. Backdraft Hellkite gives you access to all the cards in your graveyard when it attacks for instants and sorceries. They all gain flashback until end of turn. So then you get to use your cards twice, which is, in my opinion, why Reanimator strategies are so powerful in the format. Dismantling Wave is another one. For each opponent, destroy up to one target artifact or enchantment that player controls. So that's by removal. You are using one card to eliminate 3 cards, probably, if you're in a standard 4-person pod. Mystic Confluence is 3 blue for an instant. You get to choose 3, and you can choose the same mode more than once. You get to counter a spell unless its controller pays 3. Return a creature to its owner's hand, or draw a card in any combination of the 3. So this is actually 3 different cards piled into one, right? And that's what a modal spell kind of works like. If you are able to, let's say, counter a spell, that's a 1-for-1. If you're able to return a creature, that's 2. And then your third is the fact that you get to draw a card off of it or return a third creature. So that is what is a 3-for-1. So that is gaining card advantage. And then creation. Grim Hireling I have as an example here. When 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, create 2 treasure tokens. Something that people often ignore is that tokens are actually a form of card advantage. So you are creating additional cards. In fact, you actually represent those cards on the table. Those tokens become physical things that you have access to until you no longer do. The temporary state of those on the board is a little bit different. Same thing with, like, let's say copy spells that go on the stack. But yeah, that is a way to gain advantage, is to create more cards via tokens. So what's the difference between card advantage and card selection? Well, advantage in particular is an increase in the number of cards in an accessible zone, right? So this is kind of a generic definition, something that I kind of came up with. Basically, even if it's tokens, right, you're on the battlefield, it's an accessible zone. If you mill cards but you're playing Kess, it's in an accessible zone. If you have cards in your hand, it's in an accessible zone. However, card selection doesn't actually increase the number of cards available. So an example of card advantage would be something like Read the Bones, right? So your card advantage is the fact that it's drawing 2 additional cards as well as it's scrying, so you get to kind of change that around, but you are increasing the amount of cards available to you. Faithless Looting, on the other hand, actually, this isn't a great example if I'm being really honest, because you do get to cast it twice, so it actually does count as 2 cards. So it is draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards, and flashback is 2 and a red to do the same thing again. Flashback is kind of like functions modally, right? Because you are creating an additional card than just the one. So Thrill of Possibility does basically the same thing as this, it's just 2. So use that as your example for card selection rather than Faithless Looting. But not increasing the amount of cards available is a really important distinction there, versus advantage being able to increase the cards available for you to play, increasing available play options. All right, so next we will move on to mana advantage. We're going to ask the same question as we asked with card advantage. It's just, how do I get that? And the answer is basically ramp, removal, and expenditure. So there are 3 different ways here, basically, right? So gaining mana advantage, if you had to put like a loose-ish definition to it, right? How much more mana than my opponents do I have on a given turn, right? So when you're talking about it like in those terms, you're going to say something like Soul Ring, right? Is probably the best way to start off at an advantage. And now by that, I do not mean, because statistically, if you play Soul Ring on like turn 1, right, you're more likely to lose that game because you have gained so much advantage in the mana department that you lose it in different ways. So, which will actually be addressed in our second episode for gaining the advantage. So, Soul Ring gives you, basically on turn 2, you always have access to 2 additional mana than you would have had you not played Soul Ring, or had you not increased your available mana. So ramp is one way to gain advantage. The second way is to use removal. So let's say your opponent casts something like Itali Primal Storm for 6 mana, and you respond with, let's say, a counter spell for 2 mana. So you have generated a 4 mana advantage, basically, with that. So when you're playing cards like that, this is why removal is like so good in some cases, especially removal that hits multiple targets, because in a lot of cases, not only are you generating card advantage, but you're also generating mana advantage. Dismantling Wave, hitting 3 permanents, all with a total of like 12 mana cost, that's a 9 mana and 2 card advantage on that. You have spent 1 card and 3 mana, and yeah, that is a great example. And then expenditure is a little bit more abstract. So you'd be talking something like spending all your mana every turn is something that a pro Magic player would tell you immediately. If you spend all your mana every turn, you are more likely to win the game. And that is true in Commander as well as in constructed formats. Spending all your mana every turn is really important. And if you can do that, you will gain a mana advantage on your opponent who, say, has 1 land left up at his or her or their at their next upkeep, basically, right? Like in a turn cycle, if they don't spend mana, you have gained advantage on them, even if it's just by 1 or something like that. So that covers mana advantage and how you gain it. Let's move on to the next point. So you'll notice a pretty similar situation here. So mana advantage versus selection. Mana advantage is an increase in amount of liquid mana versus opponents. We talked about liquidity earlier. So the ability to just like spend that mana. And then selection, no increase in liquid mana, so you don't actually end up having it. So an example that kind of encompasses both of these actually is Prismatic Lens. So this is an artifact that under normal circumstances generates mana advantage by tapping for a colorless. So it increases the amount of available mana in your mana pool. Conversely, you can also pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color. And this effect is called filtering, which you have for multiple different things, but this particular one, you aren't actually generating an increase in mana in this case. So let's say you tap a land and you tap Prismatic Lens, right? Because you are paying the 1 to tap it and add 1 mana of any color. You are actually not generating any additional mana from this permanent, the Prismatic Lens. You are actually just changing the color of the original. So that is not going to generate advantage, that's going to generate selection. So that is not always bad. Sometimes you really do need that additional 1 mana of a specific color. Say you have like 2 or 3 pips on a card, so you have to have like 3 red or something like that in order to cast it. Yeah, selection is not bad, it is just different. But to gain advantage, you have to actually generate additional mana than you should have on a given turn. All right, so when you're talking about life totals, right? Gaining advantage on life totals is pretty easy because all you have to do is increase the disparity of life totals. You only start off with 40 life versus your opponent's 120. This is what makes it so hard to run aggressive strategies in Commander. Because this is one of the resources that it's the hardest to deplete. And in fact, a lot of people, because it is such a readily available resource, extraordinarily liquid, if you will, they use it. They leverage their life total with cards like, let's say, Ad Nauseam or Necropotence, right? The life total becomes a resource. And if you can increase that disparity in life totals, if you can actually decrease your opponent's life totals, that's going to be the most effective way to actually get them. Well, obviously getting a player to 0 is really important. Because that's how you win the game, or if you have an alternate win condition, whatever. But increasing the disparity in life totals is really important. So cards that actually do punishing effects, cards like Cemetery Gatekeeper or Obosh, the Prey Piercer, or anything that really deals damage to your opponents for standard game actions, actually is leveraging their life totals against yours. So that is something to consider, especially if you have the ability to like avoid that damage somehow or use it to your benefit. That would be a way to generate advantage. or to use, on the other hand, you can actually use your life total to pour into cards like Ad Nauseam and Necropotence and leverage your life total in order to. The usual attempt when you're talking about these cards is you are trying to find a win condition, and therefore your life total is inconsequential, to the point that you are trying to end the game at that particular moment, which means that you are trying to find a combo or a piece or something like that that will take your opponents down to 0 so you don't have to worry about your life total anymore. So yeah, leveraging your life total and depleting your opponent's life totals both can be very important ways to gain an advantage in a game. So if you have something that can start getting in for damage early in significant amounts, that is a great way to do that. All right, so let's talk about some takeaways from this. We are going to establish mana, card, and life advantage as often as we can. So how we do this, obviously, is we choose effective ramp or ways to disrupt opponent's ramp if we're generating mana advantage. We are going to gain access to as many play options as possible by drawing cards, by getting access to a graveyard, by creating tokens, any of those types of things, right? And then life advantage. The fewer opponents you have, the easier it is to establish the advantage in the board. If you can eliminate an opponent one way or the other, even if it is just by politicking, which we will address in the next episode, probably via a podcast on this particular one, just because it is so involved. Yeah, the easier it is to establish your advantage. You're not competing for as many cards, you're not competing for as much mana, so every advantage that you get from the point when you eliminate an opponent onward is increased by a percentage. So that is something really good to take away from this particular thing. All right, thanks for watching our video. Hopefully, this has given you a good insight in how to generate advantage when you're playing games. You generate it through mana, you generate it through life, you generate it through card draw and card advantage. So as long as those are clear, I think you're going to have a great time playing and kind of like analyzing in the moment how individual cards work, and especially when you're deck building, being able to pinpoint those cards that generate a significant amount of advantage will make you into a better deck builder and ultimately a better player. With that, like the video, subscribe to the channel. If you're able, support me on Patreon. That is what's going to keep this going, keep the lights on around here. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up at CQCrunch on Twitter, as well as at my Commander Quantified Discord channel. I will be as active as I possibly can on those things. I do full-time care for a child, so that is a thing. But yeah, I am often available and ready to help you where able. Patrons do get extra stuff, so I will be doing live streams on which I will be answering questions from my patrons and things like that, just live, ready to go. Yeah, absolutely. Anything else that you want to bring to my attention, any comments you have, I appreciate all your support. Thank you so much, and well, you know what? We'll catch you on the flip side.